The stone was cold beneath her feet, always cold, even in summer, even after 40 years. Eleanor the Younger had stopped counting the days sometime during the third decade. Time, she learned, was measured differently when you could see the sun but never walk toward it, when you could hear church bells marking the hours of a city you would never enter again, when letters arrived from a world that had forgotten you were still breathing. Her rooms were beautiful. Tapestries from Flanders, windows that overlooked gardens she was not permitted to enter, servants who brought her meals and never met her eyes. She had everything except the one thing that mattered. The door opened outward, never inward. She was the daughter of a queen. Eleanor of Aquitaine, the most powerful woman in Europe, had given birth to her. But that lineage, that blood, that connection to power was precisely why Eleanor the Younger would spend 16 years imprisoned by her own brother, King John of England. Not for treason, not for conspiracy, simply because she existed, and her existence represented a threat to the succession he had fought so hard to secure. This is a story about women like her, women who were too valuable to kill and too dangerous to free. Women who knew too much, had seen too much, or represented too much to ever be allowed to disappear. History remembers their names only in fragments, entries in household ledgers, footnotes in political treaties, shadows in portraits painted for courts that wanted proof of their mercy. Because that was the calculation. Death created martyrs. Martyrs created problems. Martyrs had graves that people could visit, names that could be whispered, causes that could be taken up by those who remained. But captivity created silence, and silence, for those who held power, was far more useful than blood. Royal courts operated as sealed systems. Once you entered certain circles, touched certain knowledge, witnessed certain events, you became part of the machinery itself. You were no longer a person with choices. You were an asset to be managed, a risk to be contained, a piece on a board that could not simply be removed without consequences. The women who found themselves in this position were not criminals. Often they were born into it. Daughters of deposed kings, wives of defeated rivals, mothers of potential heirs, sisters who knew too much about succession disputes. Their crime was proximity. Their sentence was survival. In the Tower of London, in Salisbury Castle, in Winchester and Corfe, women of royal blood spent decades in what official documents called protective custody. Eleanor the Younger was joined in captivity by her own daughter, also named Eleanor. 3 generations of women from the same family, all deemed too dangerous to release. The logic was clear to those who imprisoned them. Eleanor the Younger had married the King of Castile. Her children had claims to thrones across Europe. If she were free, she could become the center of alliances that threatened England. If her daughter were free, she could be married to create power blocks that King John could not control. If either of them could move freely, speak freely, or act freely, they could reshape the political landscape simply by existing in it. So they were kept, not tortured, not killed, kept. The distinction mattered to those in power. It allowed them to claim mercy. Look, they could say, we have not spilled blood. We have provided comfortable quarters. We have allowed them to practice their faith, to maintain their dignity, to live in a manner befitting their station. What more could they possibly want? Freedom was not part of the negotiation. Eleanor the Younger lived in rooms that had been carefully prepared, furniture appropriate to her rank, clothing that reflected her status, meals that were recorded in ledgers with meticulous detail, proof, should anyone ask, that she was being treated well. The king's accounts show expenditures for her comfort: wine, fabric, candles, servants' wages. What the accounts do not show is the authorization required for her to walk from one room to another, the guards stationed at every entrance, the protocol that governed who could visit her and what they could discuss, the surveillance that transformed every conversation into a potential security risk. She was 43 when her brother finally died and she was released. 16 years gone, her children grown, her husband remarried, the world she had known entirely transformed. She lived only one more year after her release, dying at 44 in 1241, as if the weight of all those years collapsed upon her the moment the door finally opened. Her daughter remained imprisoned for another 7 years. Across Europe, the pattern repeated with ruthless consistency. The architecture changed, the languages changed, the specific legal justifications changed, the outcome did not. In Castile, Blanche of Bourbon married King Pedro in 1353, a marriage arranged to secure French alliance. The wedding was magnificent. Celebrations lasted for days. Representatives from the French court attended, bearing gifts that symbolized the new bond between kingdoms. Blanche was 20 years old, educated, fluent in multiple languages, prepared for her role as queen.
3 days after the wedding, the king abandoned her for his mistress, Maria de Padilla. Blanche was moved to a series of castles, each one described in official documents as a residence befitting a queen. The reality was imprisonment. She had servants, but they were chosen by the king's officials. She had beautiful rooms, but she could not leave them without authorization. She had everything a queen should have except power, freedom, or hope. She could not return to France. Her presence in Castile symbolized the alliance between the kingdoms. Her departure would signal its collapse, would humiliate the French crown, would undermine years of diplomatic negotiation. The marriage had served its political purpose the moment the vows were spoken. What happened to Blanche afterward was irrelevant to that purpose. She could not remarry. She was already married, legally and sacramentally. The marriage had been consummated, witnesses had been present, as protocol required. She was Queen of Castile, whether the king acknowledged her or not. She could not take religious vows without the king's permission, which he would not grant. Allowing her to enter a convent would raise questions about the validity of their marriage. If she was permitted to become a nun, it would imply the marriage could be dissolved. And if the marriage could be dissolved, the alliance it represented would be void. So Blanche could only wait. She spent 8 years this way. 8 years moved from castle to castle whenever political circumstances required it. When the king needed to demonstrate to France that she was alive and well treated, she would be brought to a more visible location, allowed carefully supervised visits with French diplomats who would report back that the queen was in good health and good spirits. When those demonstrations were no longer necessary, she would be moved somewhere more remote. She wrote letters to her family in France, to church authorities, to anyone who might intervene on her behalf. The letters were careful, phrased in language that would not anger the king or his officials. She expressed her loneliness in terms of missing her family. She described her isolation as an unfortunate consequence of political circumstances. She never directly accused anyone of imprisoning her. The letters went unanswered or received responses that promised nothing. Her family in France wanted the alliance to hold. Pressuring King Pedro too aggressively might cause him to repudiate the marriage entirely, which would be even worse than the current situation. So they wrote sympathetic letters and did nothing. Blanche was moved to Arevalo, then to Toledo, then to Sigüenza. Each castle had different rooms, different views from the windows, different servants. The fundamental situation remained identical. She was a queen with no kingdom, a wife with no husband, a political symbol kept alive and contained. In 1361, she was moved to Medina Sidonia, a fortress in the south. The official reason was security. There had been unrest in the region, and she needed to be protected. The real reason was distance. Medina Sidonia was remote, far from the main centers of power, far from anyone who might ask uncomfortable questions about the queen. Within months, she was dead. The official cause was plague. Plague was common in the region that year. People died from it regularly. It was a plausible explanation, medically sound, impossible to disprove. Rumors suggested poison. The timing was convenient. King Pedro wanted to marry Maria de Padilla, wanted to legitimize the children he had fathered with her, wanted to resolve the awkward situation of having a living wife he had no intention of acknowledging. Blanche's death solved that problem cleanly.
Whether she was murdered or died of illness, the result was the same. She was 28 years old. She had spent 8 years, nearly a third of her life, waiting for circumstances to change, for someone to rescue her, for some resolution to a situation that had been designed to have no resolution. Even death, when it finally came, was a matter of political calculation. The pattern was not unique to Christian Europe. In the Byzantine Empire, the practice had been refined over centuries into a system so established it had its own architecture, its own protocols, its own vocabulary. The gymnasium, the women's quarters, functioned as both palace and prison for women whose presence in the outside world posed problems for whoever currently held power. Empress Zoe Carbonopsina knew these quarters well. She had entered the imperial household as the mistress of Emperor Leo VI at a time when mistresses were common but rarely acknowledged officially. She bore him a son, Constantine, when his 3 successive wives had failed to produce a male heir. The empire needed an heir. Leo needed a son. Zoe had provided what 3 empresses could not. When Leo finally married her in 906, making their son legitimate, the scandal threatened to tear the Byzantine Empire apart. Church authorities condemned the marriage. Forced marriages violated canon law. The Patriarch of Constantinople refused to recognize it. Political factions formed around the question of the boy's legitimacy. Was he a bastard elevated by convenience, or the rightful heir secured by necessity? Zoe had risen from mistress to empress, but her position was built on unstable ground. When Leo died in 912, Zoe became regent for their son, Constantine VII, who was only 7 years old. She held power for 7 years, navigating Byzantine politics with skill and determination. She managed military campaigns, ecclesiastical disputes, palace intrigue. She proved herself capable of governance.
But her position was always precarious. She was a former mistress, elevated to empress. She had enemies in the church who had never accepted her marriage. She had enemies in the aristocracy who resented her influence. She had enemies in the military who questioned whether a woman, especially one with her background, should hold power. In 919, those enemies moved against her. A coalition of church officials and aristocrats demanded her removal. They did not accuse her of incompetence. They did not need to. Her very presence in power offended their sense of proper order. She was removed from power and confined to a monastery, officially for her own protection, officially because she had chosen to retire from political life. The documents described it as voluntary. Zoe spent the next 8 years in the monastery, watching from a distance as others governed in her son's name, making decisions she would have made differently, pursuing policies she would have opposed. She was still alive, still aware, still capable, still close enough to the capital that news reached her regularly, still completely unable to act. She could see what was happening. She could not stop it. That was the design. Zoe spent the next 8 years in the monastery, watching as others governed in her son's name, making decisions she would have made differently. She received reports, carefully filtered through intermediaries who understood that some information was too dangerous to share with a woman who no longer held power. She heard about policies implemented, alliances formed, enemies appeased or destroyed. She understood the shape of Byzantine politics continuing without her. She was still alive, still close enough to the capital that church bells carried across the water on quiet mornings, still aware of everything she had lost. The room where she spent her days had a window that faced Constantinople. On clear days, she could see the dome Hagia Sophia rising above the city. She had walked those marble floors. She had sat in the imperial box during services. She had made decisions that affected millions. Now she woke to bells that marked hours of prayer instead of hours of state business. She ate meals prepared by nuns instead of imperial chefs. She wore simple robes instead of silk embroidered with gold. The change was described as spiritual transformation. The reality was erasure. Letters arrived occasionally from her son, formal and respectful, telling her nothing of substance. She learned to read what was not written. When letters stopped coming from certain officials, she knew they had fallen from favor. When new names appeared in the careful reports she received, she knew the balance of power had shifted. She could map the entire political landscape of the empire from her monastery cell, understanding everything and able to influence nothing.
When her son Constantine VII finally reached maturity and took real control of the empire in 927, one of his first acts was to bring his mother back from the monastery. She was 52 years old. She had been removed from power at 44, in the prime of her political capability. 8 years had passed. She returned to the palace. But Zoe was no longer the same woman. The years of confinement, the helplessness of watching her son from a distance, the knowledge that she had been discarded the moment she became inconvenient, all of it had marked her. She moved through the palace like a ghost, haunting rooms where she had once commanded. She attended ceremonies but did not speak at council meetings. She received visitors but offered no political advice. She watched, silent, as her son governed. She lived quietly in the palace for her remaining years, never again attempting to exercise political influence. She had learned the lesson her enemies wanted her to learn. Power was not hers to keep. It could be taken at any moment, and resistance only prolonged suffering. The captivity had achieved its purpose. It had neutralized her without creating a martyr. She was alive, visible proof of imperial mercy. She had not been executed or exiled. She had simply been set aside, and when she returned, she knew her place. The Gynoeceum held dozens of women like Zoe over the centuries. Each one had risen to power through skill, intelligence, or circumstance. Each one had been removed when that power became inconvenient. Each one learned that survival required silence. Empress Theophano, accused of conspiring to murder her husband, Emperor Romanos II, was confined there after his death in 969. The accusation came from political enemies who needed to remove her from influence over her young sons, the rightful heirs. She may or may not have been guilty. The evidence was circumstantial, the accusations politically motivated. Witnesses could be found to support any narrative when enough pressure was applied. But guilt was irrelevant. Theophano knew too much about court politics. She had sat in rooms where decisions were made. She had built alliances with military commanders, church officials, and aristocratic families. She knew which advisors could be bought, which generals harbored ambitions, which factions were waiting for opportunity. She had connections throughout the empire, relationships that could be activated if she were free to do so. She represented too many potential complications for whoever would govern in her son's names. She was kept in the Gynoeceum for 7 years. 7 years in comfortable rooms that were nonetheless a cage. She could see her sons occasionally, brief visits supervised by officials who monitored every word exchanged. She watched them grow from boys into young men, their educations managed by others, their political development shaped by advisors she had not chosen. In 976, she was released to a distant monastery, the Petrion Monastery, far from the capital. The official position was that she had chosen religious life, that after years of reflection, she had decided to devote herself to prayer and contemplation. Documents were prepared describing her voluntary choice. Witnesses testified to her sincere desire for spiritual retreat. The reality was that she had been given a choice between comfortable captivity in one location or comfortable captivity in another, the Gynoeceum or the monastery, the palace complex or the religious house, Constantinople or distant obscurity. She chose the monastery. At least there, she was far enough from the capital that news of political changes reached her slowly, filtered through layers of protocol and discretion. She did not have to hear about decisions being made in her son's names by men who had worked to remove her.
She did not have to see former allies who now avoided acknowledging her existence. She did not have to watch others living the life that had been taken from her. She lived another decade in enforced obscurity, dying in 986 or 987. She was approximately 55 years old. She had spent the last 17 years of her life in various forms of captivity, 7 in the gynoeceum, 10 in the monastery. Whether she had actually conspired against her husband was a question that died with her, unanswered and ultimately irrelevant. The system had not needed to prove her guilt, it had only needed to contain her. In the Forbidden City, half a world away and centuries later, the system operated with even greater precision. The imperial household held thousands of women at its peak, organized into a hierarchy so complex that it required official documentation to track every position, every privilege, every restriction. Ranks were assigned, titles were granted, allowances were calculated, living quarters were designated based on status. Every woman in the Forbidden City existed in a defined position within a structure that had been refined over dynasties to ensure complete control. Consort Yu, who entered the palace during the reign of the Kangxi Emperor in the late 17th century, understood this system. She had risen to a position of considerable influence through intelligence, beauty, and political skill. She bore the emperor a son, which elevated her status significantly. She navigated the treacherous politics of the inner court for decades, building alliances, avoiding enemies, maintaining favor. But when the Kangxi Emperor died in 1722, Consort Yu's entire position collapsed in a single day. Her son was not chosen as heir. The succession went to another of the emperor's sons, who became the Yongzhang Emperor. In that moment, Consort Yu transformed from a woman of influence to a woman who represented risk. She had been close to the previous emperor. She had witnessed private conversations about the succession. She knew which sons had been considered, which officials had argued for which candidates, which compromises had been struck in secret meetings. The new emperor viewed her with suspicion. She knew details about the succession that he would have preferred remained hidden. She could share information that might undermine his legitimacy, might give ammunition to rivals, might create doubts about whether he had truly been his father's choice. She was not executed. Executing the consort of the previous emperor would have been seen as disrespectful to his memory. She was not exiled. Exile might allow her to communicate freely with others outside the palace. She was simply transferred to a different section of the Forbidden City, to quarters designated for consorts who had lost their patrons. The transfer was documented in official records as appropriate to her changed status. She retained her rank, she was provided for according to established protocol, her material needs were met. Guards were assigned to ensure her safety. She lived there for another 16 years. 16 years in rooms she could not leave without authorization. 16 years following routines established by palace regulations that had governed women's lives for centuries. 16 years watching seasons change through windows that faced interior courtyards, never the world beyond the walls. Her rank was maintained, her material needs were met, her freedom was non-existent. She could not leave the Forbidden City, could not send unsupervised letters, could not meet with visitors who had not been cleared by palace officials, could not do anything except exist in a state of permanent suspension, neither fully alive in any meaningful sense, nor granted the release of death. The daily routine was structured to eliminate even the illusion of choice, rising at designated hours, eating meals prepared and delivered according to schedule, walking in designated courtyards at designated times, every action governed by protocol that had been established long before she entered the palace and would continue long after she left it. Consort Yu was one of hundreds of women in similar positions throughout the Qing dynasty. Some had been consorts like her. Others had been attendants who had witnessed things they should not have seen. Still others were simply women who had entered the palace young and lived long enough to become inconvenient,
too old to be useful, too knowledgeable to be released. The system maintained them all with bureaucratic efficiency. Ledgers tracked their expenditures, reports documented their health, regulations governed every aspect of their lives. They were managed, not punished, contained, not persecuted. The cruelty was in the precision. Across the Islamic world, the harem system served similar functions, though the specifics varied by dynasty and region. In the Ottoman Empire, the Topkapi Palace housed hundreds of women whose status ranged from slaves to mothers of sultans. Kösem Sultan understood power as well as any emperor. She had entered the harem as a slave, risen to become the favorite of Sultan Ahmed I, and after his death in 1617, wielded influence as the mother of successive sultans for decades. She effectively ruled the Ottoman Empire during the reign of her son Murad IV, and then her grandson Mehmed IV. But power in the harem was always contingent. It depended on having a son in power, on maintaining alliances with key officials, on managing rival factions within the palace. In 1651, those alliances collapsed. Kösem was accused of plotting against her grandson. Whether the accusation was true is debated by historians. What is certain is that she was strangled to death in the palace by enemies who could no longer allow her to live. Even Kösem, with all her power and political skill, could not escape the fundamental reality of the harem. Once inside, you existed at the pleasure of those who controlled the doors. Freedom was not possible, only degrees of influence within captivity. Most women in the harem never achieved Kösem's power. They spent their entire lives in the palace, serving, waiting, hoping for favor that might never come. If they bore children, those children might rise to power, or might not. If they caught the sultan's attention, they might gain status, or might be forgotten after a single night. What they could not do, under any circumstances, was leave. The harem was described in official documents as a place of honor, where women of the sultan's household lived in safety and luxury. The description was accurate in its details and completely misleading in its implications. The luxury was real. The safety was real. So were the guards, the protocols, the absolute prohibition on unsupervised departure.
Shevkefsa Sultan spent more than 50 years in the Ottoman harem. She entered as a young woman, gave birth to a son who never became sultan, and lived into old age as the empire changed beyond recognition. Wars erupted and ended. Reforms arrived and vanished. The world outside her palace transformed. Inside, nothing changed. The corridors were the same. The walls were the same. The courtyard she gazed upon day after day offered the same view. Reports of the world beyond came second-hand, filtered through servants and scribes. She had not chosen this life, but after decades within it, any other existence became unimaginable. She died there in 1889, 85 years old. In Russia, noblewomen faced a parallel confinement. Divorce was impossible under the Orthodox Church, but convents offered an alternative for those deemed inconvenient. Eudoxia Lapukina, first wife of Peter the Great, learned this in 1698. Peter wanted a new marriage to serve his vision for Russia. Eudoxia, 30 years old and mother to a young son, was given a choice: enter a convent voluntarily or by force. She chose voluntary exile, adopting the name Sister Elena. At first, her confinement was bearable. Visitors came, letters went out. She could sustain the illusion of freedom. But by 1718, Peter discovered she corresponded with his opponents. She was transferred to stricter quarters, placed under constant surveillance, and cut off from her son. For 9 years, she existed in absolute isolation. When Peter died, she was 59, having spent 29 years in convents, 9 of them in total darkness from the world. She died 4 years later, bewildered by the life she had re-entered. Princess Tarakhanova faced a subtler trap. Claiming to be the daughter of Empress Elizabeth, she became a threat to Catherine the Great. Lured under false pretenses to Italy, she was seized by Russian agents and imprisoned in the Peter and Paul fortress. She was neither tried nor executed. She spent a year in isolation, dying of tuberculosis. Officially, she had vanished. In reality, she had been erased. In Mughal India, Jahanara Begum, daughter of Shah Jahan, lived her life inside the zenana. Highly educated, politically influential, she never married, kept for counsel rather than freedom. When her father was imprisoned by Aurangzeb, she chose to accompany him into captivity. 8 years of captivity became routine, even voluntary. She returned to the palace afterward, still unable to step into a life of autonomy, dying at 67. These stories repeat across centuries and empires. Comfort, influence, or education did not guarantee freedom. What mattered was control. Death was public, captivity was invisible, rationalized as protection, retirement, or duty. Records minimized it. Letters were coded, praising mercy while concealing despair. I am content meant I have stopped wanting what I cannot have. I spend my days in prayer meant I have nothing else to do. Eleanor the Younger, Blanche of Bourbon, Zoe Carbonopsina, Shev Kefsa Sultan, Eudoxia Lapukina, Tarakanova, Jahanara Begum all endured decades in rooms that became prisons. Guards were replaced, staff retrained, routines institutionalized. Freedom became unimaginable. Release was politically inconvenient. They were kept alive, not out of mercy, but because their existence, contained, solved a problem quietly. The cruelty was not in the food, the linens, the luxury. It was in the years, day after day, year after year, decade after decade. The knowledge that no circumstance would change, no mercy would arrive, no door would open. They were alive, breathing, maintained, but never free. The stones beneath their feet remained cold, the walls never moved, and time which should have belonged to them, was stolen, reserved for those who had taken everything else.